If you've been listening to this podcast over the past few months, you know we've been focused on two things: the housing crisis and transportation, and how deeply interconnected they are. Just think about your own day, how you move from one place to the next, where you live, where you work, what's accessible to you. In a lot of ways, we're all shaped by the systems that define our cities. So we're digging into what it really means to build more and why upzoning, especially around transit, is so often seen as a path towards better cities. And today you're in for a two-part treat. First, we break down how much we build because, truth be told, we've been sold an oversimplified version of how upzoning actually impacts the housing crisis. For that, I bring in Yonah Freemark, a senior research associate at the Urban Institute, where he studies land use, housing, and transportation, and has led some of the most comprehensive research on how zoning reforms shape housing production across U.S. cities. Then we take it to the streets, literally. In part two, I'm joined by both Yonah and Sam Sklar, the mastermind behind Exasperated infrastructure, to build in the transportation side of the story and understand where we build and how mobility investments actually play out in real time. Because you can't fully understand what and how much to build without understanding where people move. I'm Kate Gasparo, and this is Building Better Cities. So Yonah, you do a lot of work both on land use and transportation, and we're going to focus the first half of this episode on your zoning work on land use and how the rules around land use have really led us to the point we're in now, but also have a huge opportunity to help us move forward and get out of this housing crisis. Zoning is often framed as both the root cause and the primary solution to the housing crisis, and people just say, like, just upzone. And more housing will come, supply will bring the whole market into stabilization. Based on your research, how central is zoning to the problem, and where does the narrative oversimplify what's actually happening?
So I think there are a few different things going on simultaneously. So one is the assumption that land use rules are the primary explanatory factor in describing why some communities build more housing and other communities don't. And the second is that the supply of housing is the determining factor in how affordable housing is. And I think the truth is that both of those arguments or claims are true to a large extent, but not true to all extents, which is to say, there are other explanations for why the housing market acts the way it does. And we need to also be thinking about those as we're thinking about, best practices for trying to make sure everybody has a place to live. I think just to start out thinking about the role of land use policy and its interaction with housing supply, I think it's unquestionably true that if you zone to make it impossible to build an apartment in a particular area, you will not be able to build an apartment in that particular area. That's not really a question. We live in the United States in a nation of laws that are almost always followed. And so the result is that, if you zone to make buildings impossible to build, then they will not be built. And that makes sense. So clearly, if you change the rules so that, you can build an apartment building, then you might be able to build an apartment building. However, zoning rules in and of themselves are not the primary explanatory factor to explain why housing actually gets built. So there are other issues at play. So number one, there has to be a housing market that is strong enough for developers to be able to make money from the investment. If an apartment building on a particular lot is not going to make enough money for a developer, then a developer will not come in and build it. That's not going to happen. And so that means that, for example, we have many situations around the United States where the zoning allows for very large buildings to be built, but those buildings do not get built. And the best explanation for that is that there just isn't the market there, that the housing values and the rental values are not high enough for developers to think they're going to make money on that. The second thing that we need to be keeping in mind is that developers are investing their own equity to a large degree in these projects, right? They're getting loans, of course, but they're also investing their own equity. They could choose to invest that equity in other parts of the economy. Okay. Developers are like the rest of us. They have savings and they can choose to invest that money in building new buildings because they think it's going to make money, or they can choose to invest that money in crypto or the stock market or whatever. So a developer has to be sure that not only is the property going to be profitable, but also the real estate market is just as or stronger than the rest of the economy that they can get into. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if the real estate market as a sort of compared to the rest of the economy is not doing so well, then the overall housing construction market is going to go down no matter what the zoning tells us. And then the third related element to this, of course, is debt. If interest rates are too high, building a project becomes more and more difficult. And that's the situation we're in today. So it doesn't really matter what the zoning is. If you can't afford to take out a loan to build the project, it's not going to get built. So, I think these are all to say the overall housing market is structured by what's financially feasible and what the economy is telling us. Zoning is giving us the allowance for what can be built in that context. So if the economy's on the upswing, if the real estate market is doing better, if interest rates are low, et cetera, then, you can have the right conditions to make zoning have value. But if those conditions aren't at play, you have a more difficult situation in terms of construction.
I like how you're framing this up in terms of an equity and debt issue. There also seems to be this cost of commodities like land and building materials that sort of is the intermediary to that financing question. And you wrote a paper in 2020 about upzoning in Chicago and how that led to increased land values to a point where it was prohibitive to developers to come in. There was no significance in the amount of building permits issued or development that came online. So can you sort of talk about this financial factor of the cost of what it takes to develop?
Since I've written my paper about Chicago, so that was 6 years ago now, done a lot more research in this subject area. And also there's been just generally a lot more research in this subject area. And I think that the basic facts are this. When you change the zoning to allow for more construction to occur, land value goes up. And the reason why land value goes up is that developers see the possibility of in the future investing in new projects that are bigger than they were before. There's a relationship between what you're allowed to build and how much land is worth, right?
Right.
That's fundamentally what I found in Chicago, and it's been repeated by others around the country when they do this type of research. Essentially, it shows that, properties go up in value, and that can make the market more challenging for investors. However, I actually don't think it means that people can't build. I think it just means that to some degree, the land value is absorbing the increase in zoning, and that will only have a net benefit on housing supply once a developer is able to come in and actually build something on that parcel. The land value kind of represents a potential that isn't realized until the construction occurs. And if the conditions aren't right to build the building during the time after the upzoning, then you can have a situation where land values go up and you're still waiting for construction to occur. And I think that's the case of what we saw in Chicago. I think it is also true that it takes a while for development to happen, right? We can speculate all we want about how zoning changes can result in additional housing supply, but fundamentally you have to have developers wanting to come in, hire an architect, buy the land, assemble the construction materials, et cetera. It takes many years to get into place. So there are stages of outcomes related to zoning changes.
We talked about this timing component of the barrier between increased zoning capacity and actual development. As a policymaker, I decide I want to implement this new zoning regime that will upzone and allow for more development. How long should I wait, or are there other tools I need to make available to developers to actually realize that gain?
I think it really depends on the location.
Mm-hmm.
In some very, tense high market communities, if you make a zoning change that is providing substantial additional zoning capacity, making it possible to build a lot more in an area where, frankly, people have not been able to build because of the zoning, then you might see a response with development happening extremely quickly, right? I mean, that's the case in a lot of rezonings that happen in places like New York City, where you make a major rezoning that substantially expands how much you can build, and developers respond almost instantaneously with projects. And that's just because there is this built-in demand for more housing that is so strong that when the city makes it possible to build more, developers will simply respond. If you're in a weaker market, that's not going to be the case. Developers are not going to rush in because there are a few obstacles in their way. One is, again, the market is not strong enough in most other places in the country. The second is that most markets have an absorption rate, which is to say, you can't just add an infinite number of housing units and expect them to be absorbed by future renters and future home buyers. Developers know that very strongly, right? They don't want to invest too much at the same time as other investors because they're worried that by the time their project opens, there aren't going to be enough new households coming in to pay the rents and home values that they were looking for. So I think developers are going to be a little cautious, right? They're going to say, what do we think other investors are doing in response to this change? How do we invest at the right amount that isn't going to make the market so large so quickly that nothing can be absorbed? So that's something we also need to keep in mind, right? With a perfect elasticity. Just because you provide more housing supply doesn't mean people will immediately come. And that's part of the reason we've seen in recent years some declines in housing costs in places like Austin, where they did build a lot of housing and the market is catching up. So what's happening is the market built a lot of housing, probably more than the developers who invested back then would have wanted. And now the market is catching up to a degree that rents have to come down. And that's just an absorption rate issue. I think the reality is if you want quick absorption, at the city level, in some cases, you need to be thinking about how to provide housing that's affordable for people with lower incomes with additional subsidies and things of that sort, which is expensive if you're a city to do.
Right. And across the many metro areas that you do your research, you did find that housing supply tends to show up more for middle and higher income households with less clear impact for lower income households. So what is that telling us about how and who upzoning is actually serving and what it can't do on its own?
Yeah, I think, what we're seeing from a lot of the data right now is that upzoning can do a really good job in responding to the housing needs of people at the middle and upper middle parts of the economy or of the income brackets. Upzoning, when you look at places that have had substantially more housing supply, their housing costs compared to income are much better compared to the places that have not added very much housing, okay, for the median household. So a person who makes the median income in a metropolitan area is going to benefit from an upzoning if that upzoning produces substantial additional housing. And that makes sense because housing that is added to the market is going to be at the relatively higher end of the market because of the cost of building a new home. And so that's going to address sort of the upper middle income bracket. Then the middle income bracket is going to filter up into the homes that were formerly occupied by the upper middle income. And so upzoning really is this great benefit for the median and upper median of the market. The lower end of the market is not going to be supported great by upzoning. It might to some small degree, but the reality is that the housing cost burden for people at the very low end of the economy is extremely high. And the amount of what we call filtering that's going to occur of housing units, even if there's a substantial upzoning, is not going to be nearly enough to make housing affordable for people at that low end. So for them, we need additional subsidies. And we're talking about 20% of the market, 30% of the market. It will need additional support.
I want to talk a little bit about the Austin case and the way that equity works in terms of when we see supply come in at a rate that absorption cannot match, and we then see rents fall. Real estate itself is an appreciation gain. So if you're not seeing that appreciation occur because rents are falling, then your equity is looking other places. And I'm curious if you are seeing that there is this now new space for impact investors or investors who are more diversified to come in, as opposed to those who are comparing crypto and NVIDIA and housing at the same time. I'm just curious, like your thoughts as we move towards sending more supply into the ecosystem. Are there other types of investors that are looking to support this work?
There are actually some large institutional investors like Amazon and Microsoft that are going around and providing sort of low cost loans to projects as a key part of their corporate philanthropic missions. So I think in some ways they're sort of acting like impact investors, right? They're saying housing remains important. We're so large, we can provide these very substantial loan funds to communities and actually get housing built at a lower profit level than a private investor only would expect.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of interest out there, and there's also a lot of interest coming from municipal and state revolving loan funds that can provide support for new housing projects with low interest rates, right?
Mm.
The government itself can become an impact investor under a certain new model. Some of this is coming out through these like momentum funds that we're seeing in places like Massachusetts, or the social housing programs that are coming out of places like Montgomery County and Seattle, where the government is directly engaging in sort of financing housing. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of potential there.
How often is it that you are being reached out to by policymakers, whether that's a mayor or a governor or a council member, ask you specifically about your advice on different zoning or policy reforms in the land use space?
I would not say as much as advocates do, because the truth is that in the work that I do, I see the sort of pros and cons of policies that don't result in me feeling like there is a clear answer to every question. And, I'm not trying to accuse advocates of being naive, but I do think it means that I'm not out there telling policymakers this answer will solve your problem, because frankly, no answer will solve anybody's problem. It may provide small benefits in some ways, but we need to be cognizant of the fact that policymakers need a whole spectrum of different policies to address concerns. And even then, we need to be careful in thinking about people who might be negatively affected in some way.
Well, in terms of the complexity here around these policies and the contextual side of how these policies are enacted in each of these cities and regions, are there policies that you see coming forth in 2026 that you are excited to see the impacts of?
I'm quite excited about the potential of some of the transit-oriented development legislation coming out of places like California and Washington State. I think there are a lot of opportunities there to generate a lot of additional housing. And also, the legislation in both of those states is careful about trying to prevent displacement in existing communities. Especially in California, there are provisions to prevent existing rental units from being demolished and replaced by new units, with the idea that, if we're encouraging more construction, we shouldn't be doing that in a way that's simply replacing the people who currently live in a community. And
Mhm.
so I think from my perspective, it's going to be really interesting to see how that type of legislation ends up impacting housing supply. I think there's a lot of opportunities there, especially if it can be done in a way that maintains the ability of people to live in the communities where they currently live.
Before we bring Sam on to talk about that interconnection of land use and transportation, you've referenced a lot of blue states and blue cities in this conversation. Have you seen examples from red states or more conservative areas around their need to also supply housing for their constituents?
Yeah. So one thing that's interesting is that a lot of the red states like Texas, Florida have been more successful in attracting additional housing. And they've been able to do that in a few different ways. One is in Texas, especially, there is a lot more freedom by developers to build on formerly agricultural or natural land compared
Mm.
to a lot of the blue states have strengthened environmental protection approaches, which essentially say that, if you have protected natural land, we don't really want development to be occurring there. And so the result is that you see the suburbs of the Dallas and Houston regions, for example, sprawling out at a level that is just incomparable with whatever's happening in blue states. And there are pros and cons of that, right? The pro is that you're able to accommodate a huge amount of new housing. And that's part of the reason why Texas is growing so rapidly, right? You're bringing in a giant amount of new housing supply. You're able to do so at actually a pretty affordable price because the land is really cheap.
Hmm.
And, people are ready to move in because they can afford the homes. I get it. On the other hand, are some major problems with that type of development. Number one, there's absolutely no accounting for the transportation costs that these people are going to experience. The further your region sprawls out, the higher the transportation costs are going to be for people who live in that region. So people are going to be driving more and more each day to get to the needs that they have. And that does impose a penalty on people who have taken advantage of lower housing costs. They end up paying less for their housing and more for their transportation. So that's one problem. And then the second problem, of course, is that, we are degrading the environment that we have. And are we just okay with continuing that ad infinitum? I'm not sure. I have concerns about the way places like Texas are developing because of the reliance on this extreme mode of sprawl as an approach to move forward. Just today, data released from the US Census that showed that Dallas County, which used to be this paragon of growth in America, is actually now losing population while its far suburbs are gaining population very quickly. I think what's going on there is that, frankly, the Dallas region is sort of continuing to move further and further out as the center degrades. That's not a good policy outcome if you care about making sure that cities remain vital. I think one other thing I wanted to sort of emphasize was, as we're thinking about additional housing units, we need to be cognizant of the different types of housing units that people might want or need. And this is related to the issue of whether development is occurring sort of in a sprawling nature or not. The reality is a huge share of Americans obviously want to live in single family homes and do live in single family homes. So if your housing development is almost entirely in the form of multifamily apartments, then you're going to have trouble responding to that particular need.
Yeah.
If your housing development is almost entirely in the form of single family homes, then you're not responding to the interest of, 30% of Americans or something who want dense walkable communities. And so I think we need to be thinking about both.
Before we jump into part 2, I want to pause here for a moment, because if there's one thing to sit with, it's this. Changing the rules doesn't automatically change the outcome. Zoning matters, but it's only one piece of a much bigger system shaping how and where housing actually gets built. So take a minute, think about how this shows up in your own city. And if this conversation shifted how you're thinking about housing, share it with someone who's part of that conversation too. When we come back, we're expanding the lens. I'll be joined again by Yonah, along with Sam Sklar, to connect land use and transportation. That's next on Building Better Cities.